Hi everyone, Frank Spangler here again for Learning Media Skills. And in today's lesson, we're going to learn how to take better photos using the manual settings of your DSLR camera. We're going to talk about why learning this skill will help improve your photos, make them more creative, and some of the things that you can do to make the transition to using manual controls easier. Ready? Let's go. Before we get started on today's lesson, I'd like to just take a moment or two and talk about how cameras work. Maybe talk about some of the different parts of the camera and how each of these parts work together to give us those beautiful photographs that we so enjoy. You know, in a lot of ways, the camera works much like our eyes work. And you probably have studied this. Light bounces off objects, and that bounced light enters the eye through the pupil. And if we are in a low light setting, the iris of our eyes uses muscles to dilate the pupils of our eyes to open wide to let more light in, so that we can see almost in the dark. On the other hand, if we step out into the bright sunlight, it may take a few seconds to adjust, but our pupils constrict to let less light in. The muscles behind the iris squeeze and stretch the lens behind the pupils to assist in the focusing of the light to the back of the eye. And it is here, the retina, where there are light-sensitive cones and rods that take the different shades of light and dark and form an image that is sent to our brain for interpretation and understanding. Well, the camera has many of these same elements. In fact, those who invented cameras, I think, studied how the eye works in order to invent cameras. In low light, the aperture of our lens can be adjusted to open up wide to let more light in, just like our pupils do. But if we step outside to take photographs in the bright sun, we can make the adjustment to our iris or aperture so that we can close it down, make the hole of the aperture much smaller to let less light in, to hit the light-sensitive image sensor of the camera. The image that forms on the image sensor is sent through the brain of the camera, the computer, and is stored on a memory card. The big difference between our eye and the camera is that our eyes, when they're open, receive a constant stream of light, much like if we were using the camera for filming video. But when taking a photograph, the camera has what's called a shutter that opens and closes very quickly to let just a little light through the lens to hit the image sensor. In order to get a good exposure, a correct exposure, we need to make sure that the image sensor receives just the right amount of light to form a well-exposed image. But not too much light, or the sensor will be overwhelmed and the photo will be overexposed. As we learned in our last lesson, there are three things that determine how much light will hit the image sensor of the camera for processing. The first thing is the aperture ring of the camera. As this chart shows, all cameras, or more specifically the lenses, have an aperture that can adjust the size of the hole that's going to let light in to hit the image sensor of the camera. Most lenses have a wide range of openings that they allow for, to have just, a very small opening to be used in bright light settings, or if you're inside and there's not much light, or it's almost getting dark, you can open up that aperture to let more and more light in. The second way that we can control how much light hits the image sensor is the shutter speed. Every camera, photographic camera, has a little door that is closed to prevent light from hitting the image sensor until you hit the shutter, and it lifts the door up and then quickly closes it again so as not to allow too much light in to hit the sensor of the camera. And you can control how long that door is open. A typical shutter speed, that we call a shutter speed, is 1/60th of a second. I know that doesn't sound like a very long time, 1/60th of a second. But believe me, when somebody's in motion, 1/60th of a second is not enough time to freeze that motion clearly. And so the camera allows us to make adjustments to the shutter speed so that we can capture different items that are in fast motion and freeze frame them. Also, if we're in a bright light setting, 60th of a second might be too long of a time and will let too much light in to hit the sensor of the camera. So it'll be overexposed at 1/60th of a second. And we're going to need to adjust the shutter speed to be much faster in order to let the correct amount of light hit the sensor of the camera. If you are filming indoors, you probably will have your shutter speed at 60, maybe even just a little bit lower if you're very good at holding the camera steady. But if you're moving outdoors to get some action shots down at the football field and you want to freeze frame that, you might want to change your shutter speed right up to 1/1000th of a second, or even faster if that is still not enough to get the freeze frame that you're looking for. The Canon 90D that we've been doing a series of lessons on will actually let you go right up to 1/8000th of a second. And believe me, that'll be fast enough to stop a baseball in motion right after it's been hit. The third control that practically every camera has that users can adjust to make sure that they are getting a correct exposure is by changing the actual sensitivity of the image sensor itself. We call it the ISO setting of the camera. If we're taking photographs indoors or in low light of dusk or dawn, we might need to set this ISO setting to 1200 or even 1600 or more to make the image sensor more sensitive to the light that comes in when we're in these dark settings. However, if we're taking photos outside on a bright sunny day, we might need to change that ISO setting right down to 100. I think that's the lowest we can go on the 90D camera, and most cameras, that's as low as you can go, 100. And in fact, some cameras won't even let you go down that far. But with the 90D, you can go down to an ISO of 100 in order to make the image sensor less sensitive to the light that's coming through the lens of the camera and hitting the sensor. Now, I know that for those who are new to photography, all of this information might seem overwhelming. So many settings to worry about. Well, the good news for people just getting started in photography is that practically all modern cameras today, even the inexpensive entry-level cameras, have little computers inside them that can make all of these decisions for you. The computer will assess the light that's available in the environment in which you are standing, and will make decisions about what it thinks would be the best combination of these three things: the aperture, the hole of the lens, the opening, the shutter speed, and the ISO. The computer will decide all of these things for you to give you a well-exposed photo in the environment in which you're standing. And so, if you are just starting in photography, you may want to keep your mode dial, and on the Canon 90D you have to press the center button down in order to turn it. You may want to keep your mode dial right on the green A for automatic. And that will allow you to concentrate for the first few weeks that you're out there on learning other important principles of getting good photos, such as composition, framing, following the rules of thirds, and that kind of thing. And if you haven't already watched it, we have a good lesson on that. I'll put the link to that video lesson in the description below, and when you get a chance, take a look at that. It'll help you describe many of the things that you can do to get better photographs even before you learn how to use the manual settings of the camera. You know, I have to say that some of the latest cameras, like the 90D, actually do a very good job at getting good exposures in most lighting conditions, even while using just the auto settings. Many people are totally fine just using the auto settings in every situation. My wife prefers auto settings. When we're passing a camera back and forth, when we're out on a hike, we always have to switch between auto and manual to get the preferred settings that we want. She would just rather not take the mental energy necessary to learn how to take photos using the manual settings. And she still gets amazing shots. She just does great. We have so many wonderful family photos that she has taken using the auto settings of the camera. I would say 80% of the photos taken in the auto settings with the 90D will be just fine. And if you know a few tricks, you can even bump that up to 90% by simply changing your position when you're out there taking photographs. You might have to move around a little bit if you're not getting the shots exposed just the way you'd like. Either change your own position or the position of your subject. Say you're taking a photo of somebody and the sun's behind them. You're not going to get a good shot unless you want a silhouette. So you simply move yourself or get the subject the other way or just off to the side so that the sun is hitting at least the side of their face. Well, you bump it up to 90%. The camera might get tricked a little bit of the time, but just by changing your position, you can compensate, even before you learn how to use the manual settings. If you would like to learn some of those tips, again, we have a video that you should watch. In fact, it's the same video as the composition principles that I was talking about earlier. So that link in the description will also talk about some of these things that you can do to help you get photographs even in difficult lighting situations where the camera is getting tricked. You know, you take a photograph, you look at the back and you see, oh, the computer messed up on that. What do I do now? I don't know how to do the manual settings. What do I do? Well, watch this video and we'll give you some good hints on that. So you might ask, if the camera computer does such a good job of getting good exposure results, why should we take the time and maybe frustration to learn how to take photos in the manual settings? Well, there are three main reasons why I would recommend that it is worth it to take the time to learn how to photograph using manual settings. First of all, while the computer usually does make good choices, There will be times when you could make better choices that will give you a cleaner, sharper image. For example, in some settings, the computer will automatically set the ISO setting higher than it needs to be. And what ends up happening is you get grainy images with lots of unwanted sensor artifacts or noise in your shot. Sometimes the computer may make your shutter speed too slow. And if you're not careful to always be holding the camera steady, you are going to end up with photos that look blurry, or you might think a little out of focus. And it's not really out of focus. It's just that when you press down on the camera, press down on the shutter, you're moving the camera down just enough to introduce blur into your shots. And if the computer of the camera has decided, oh, it's kind of low light here, I'm going to push it down to 1/30th of a second. And so just pressing down on the shutter moves your lens down enough that 1/30th of a second will often introduce a little bit of motion down on the camera, which ends up looking like the camera's a little bit out of focus, or there's something wrong with it. Now, as you look at the image, after you take it on the back of the camera, because it's such a small screen, it looks fine. And so you move on and get other shots. It's not until you get home or back to the office and load these shots up into your big computer screen that you see you've got a problem. And if you're not able to go back and get the same photograph again, you could be in trouble, relying completely on the computer of the camera, because it's not going to be that noticeable what decisions it's making. If you keep your eye on the meter at the very bottom of your viewfinder, if you look down, you'll see a little meter there. It does actually, and you're on the auto settings, it does actually read out the shutter speed as well as the f-stop and the ISO. But if you're concentrating on framing the camera and exciting things are happening all around you, you may not always be paying attention to the decisions that the computer is making, and you end up back at home looking at shots that are a little bit out of focus, apparently out of focus. And so for those types of scenarios, if you knew how to take photos in the manual settings, you would be the one that's always sure what the shutter speed is at, because you were the one that set it there. And if you know that in this dark setting, you are trying for 1/30th of a second, I'm guessing that you are going to be more conscientious about whether or not you got blur when you took the shot. You might be more careful to hold the camera more steady. Or you might use the trick that I've mentioned a couple of times to use the 2-second delay, so that when you press the button, you've got 2 seconds to get yourself very steady. Maybe you're leaning up against a pole or a wall or a tree, to give you that more stability for that 1/30th of a second shutter speed. After you get the shot, you might take the time to look and check and make sure it's okay. And even though you have a small screen, you can do the pinch function and enlarge that photograph so that you get right up into the face or the eye and make sure that you have what you need. And if you're on the manual settings, you know when you need to check if you've got a very low shutter speed. The second reason why I believe it is important to learn how to take photographs in the manual settings is that it gives you more creative control. Let's say that you want to make sure that everything in your photo is going to be in focus. Let's say you're taking a group shot and you have to have 3 layers of people. The group is so big. Well, if you're on the auto settings, what can happen is the computer might decide, oh, let's focus in on the faces of the front row. and have much of the rest of the photograph blurry. Again, you might not notice it when you take a look at the small screen, but when you get back home, you realize the computer had a very low aperture, and it was thinking that you're trying to take maybe a portrait of a face where everything in the background is blurry, and it set it way down to 2.8, and only the people in your front row are going to be in focus. In fact, maybe only one or two people in the center are going to be in focus. Wherever you little focus square is on, that's what's going to be in focus, and even the front row on either side might be out of focus. If you knew how to work with the manual settings, you'd never have to worry about the computer making the wrong f-stop choice to give you the two back rows being out of focus. If you, on the other hand, are trying to take a photograph of just one person and get that beautiful bokeh in the back and the out of focus background, that's what you're hoping for, but the computer might decide to put the f-stop at 11 or 13 as if you're taking a scenic shot, and you get everything in focus. It's okay. You got a photograph. People will be perfectly happy with it, but you could have done better having complete control over the settings. Let's say you're out there taking a photo of a group of children running around and you want them to be completely frozen. Well, again, if you're in the auto settings, the computer might not realize what you're trying to do, and you get children all blurry. The feet, or as they are in motion, they might be in blur. On the other hand, if that's what you're looking for, the computer could do the opposite thing and freeze frame everything. And so it's only as you learn how to work with the manual settings that you can be able to become more creative and specifically dial in the settings that you know you need to do in order to get what you're looking for in a creative way. The third reason why I recommend you taking the time to learn manual settings is because today's cameras, including this 90D camera that we're doing our series of lessons on, have the ability to get really great looking video. You know, here is a camera that we can recommend to staff out in the field. And they can use this entry-level camera, doesn't cost them much to get into, to take amazing 4K video that they can send back to me for editing. And it just works out wonderful. The thing is, in order to use a DSLR camera like this for filming, you really need to learn how to work with the manual settings of the camera. And if you're going to take the time to learn the manual settings for shooting video, you might as well learn how to use the camera, the manual settings of the camera, to take still photographs as well. And that will give you that extra advantage, that extra ability to take really wonderful, beautiful, creative still photos as well. Now, I know that some of you might be saying, yeah, I know it sounds good, but I don't know. It just seems like a lot of settings to worry about when I just want to, take photographs. Do I really want to learn how to work with all of those settings? It's interesting how different people have different perspectives. Some will say, oh, dear me, learning how to make adjustments to 3 different controls at the same time on a camera, it's just too much. I'm too old for that kind of thing. I can't learn new tricks. I think I'm just going to stay on the green auto setting of the camera. Others will say, you mean all I have to do is learn 3 camera settings and I can start taking photos on manual? Really? Only 3? That's amazing. Why didn't I learn this years ago? I can't believe that I didn't stop to take the time. Right now I could have a hard drive full of more creative photos. If I'd just taken that time to learn how to work with the manual settings. So, I hope you're in the group that says, "Oh, there's only 3? I can do that. I got this." And it actually gets better than that. In most scenarios, you only need to worry about adjusting 2 settings. And the reason is that most of the time you will remain in the same lighting conditions for maybe 2 or 3 hours at a time, which means that often you only have to set the ISO setting once as you begin to photograph. Set it and forget it. And that leaves you with only 2 settings to worry about getting the right control. And as we'll learn in our next lesson, when it comes time to filming, getting video with your camera in the manual settings, that for the most part, you only have to worry about changing 1 setting. The other 2 pretty much stay constant the whole time. You just only have to worry about changing the f-stop as you move around into different lighting situations. The rest pretty much stay the same during the whole shoot. But let's get back to taking photos. In this lesson, that's what we're concentrating on. After we have set a good ISO for our environment, we will then most likely be making rapid adjustments to both the shutter speed and the aperture in order to get those great creative photos that we're trying for. Thankfully, most cameras have 2 wheels on the camera that make it very easy to make these adjustments. On the Canon 90D, these wheels are placed in very convenient places so that you can quickly change your settings just using one hand. Want to change your shutter speed? Just take your index finger and roll this top wheel back and forth. Want to change your aperture, your f-stop? Just use your thumb to roll the wheel at the back. To see the readout of your adjustments that you're making, there are 3 screens that you can see what you're doing. There's the screen at the top as you just turn your camera on and press down on the shutter speed halfway, and just notice as you turn the top wheel, there's a readout of the adjustments that you're making on the f-stop and the shutter speed. Now I have my lens cap on, so it doesn't have much latitude on it working, but if possible, point your camera lens at a light area. It's kind of a dark room right now. But as you turn these wheels and dials, you will see the adjustments in real time. Another place that you can see them is when you look through the viewfinder. If you're the type of person that likes to frame their shots by looking through the viewfinder, which I like to do, and maybe I'm a little old school, I don't know, but I like the clean glass as I'm making my framing and focusing. I like to be able to look through the viewfinder. I find that I'm more steady when I'm holding the camera with 2 hands like this and it's pressed up against my face. I can be down at a lower shutter speed and not have to worry about that motion blur that we're talking about. Well, as you look down at the bottom of the screen, as you lightly touch the shutter release, you'll see those meters show up there. And as you adjust your wheels for your shutter speed and your aperture, you will see the readout change in real time. You'll notice that there's a meter there kind of in the center that goes from -3 right up to +3. And as you make your adjustments, that meter is going to go up and down across that meter area. And what you want to do is try and get that needle as close to the center as possible, and that lets you know that you're going to get a well-exposed shot. Third place that you can see this very easily is on the view screen at the back of the camera. Now, these 90Ds actually have an articulating screen if you want. You could have it out, turn it around, and that way, as you press down on this Start Stop button, first of all, change it to the Make sure it's selected to not the red video camera, but the white still camera. Now when you press the start button, you'll see the image that's coming through the lens live on your screen. And what's really great is as you change, press down on your shutter release just a little bit, and as you change your top wheel and your back wheel, your shutter speed and your f-stops, you will see in real time the adjustments showing up in the meters below. And that's great to see it. Not only will you see the adjustments happening on the screen, but you will see the image change darker and lighter as you scroll back and forth on these adjustments. It's just like a mirrorless camera. You are able to see live the changes that are happening as you move these wheels and dials. And you can not only judge by the meter being right in the center there to give you a correctly exposed shot, but you can also see the visual to know for yourself whether it's a good looking shot or not before you take the shot. Now, if you're in a difficult lighting situation, like maybe your subject is backlit, the sun is coming from behind them, and you want to make an adjustment so that the face is properly exposed instead of the brightness behind them. Maybe the person is standing in front of a window, sitting in front of a window. Well, just by looking at the screen in this live mode, even though your meter might be right in the center, you can tell that no, there's still a problem. But because you can see it live, you can now, with your manual controls, make the adjustments rather than let the computer make the adjustments for you or make the best guess. And in those kinds of situations, it's probably going to expose for the bright window or the bright sunlight behind your subject. But because you're manually controlling the camera, you can override the computer and make the adjustments to the exposure, the shutter speed, and the f-stop to make the face be correctly exposed. Now, it might blow out the background, but at least you get the person correctly exposed. And that's one of the benefits of being able to manually override the computer using manual settings. Now, I think it's important that we take a moment to talk a little bit more in detail about aperture. Again, the aperture ring can be adjusted to make the hole in your lens open bigger to let more light in, or by adjusting your aperture ring, and in the case of the 90D, it's the wheel at the back when you're in the manual settings. Only when you're in the manual settings, by the way. I think we pointed out in our last lesson that if you're on the AV or the TV or the P, that's not always going to be true. But when you're in the manual settings on the 90D, the wheel at the back is going to adjust the aperture, the little opening that you can adjust on the lenses of your camera. So as you turn that wheel, the hole's getting smaller. You turn it the other way, it's opening up to let more light in. So make sure that your camera is set to the M. Open up your screen, hit the start-stop button so you can see what you're doing as you turn the wheel. I want you to notice that as you turn the wheel back and forth, there's a box there that has an F in front of it, and the numbers change as you adjust that wheel. The F stands for f-stops, and it's a standardized way that no matter what camera model you're working with, brand name, it's a standardized system of aperture openings that works with all lenses. And you can know that if you're at f-stop 2.8, you're going to get that nice bokeh effect when you take a portrait. If you turn the wheel back to f11, f13, you're going to get a photograph that's completely in focus. Everything's in focus. And it can be a little counterintuitive at first because the way the system works, the f-stop, the higher the number, the smaller the hole. That's something that you need to keep in mind. The higher the f-stop, the higher the number on the F or beside the F, the smaller the hole. The lower the number, the bigger the hole to let more light in. Now, you should know that the range of f-stops is going to be different based on the lens that you have attached to the body of your camera. Some very expensive lenses can go from f-stop 1.4 even. It's really what we call a fast lens. It's a very wide opening. Right up through f36. Other lenses that are less expensive, like the kit lens here that comes with the 90D, will only have a range of f3.5 through f22. So if you're used to seeing f-stops that are 2.8 and your 90D with the kit lens, you just can't seem to get that 2.8 anymore. Well, it's because of the lens. Canon put a kit lens, or at least provided an opportunity for you to get a package with a kit lens that does a pretty good job, but in order to keep it a very inexpensive entry level, they made some compromises on the lens. And so it's only ever going to get down to 3.5 and go through f22. And you should know that that will change if you've got your lens extended out. If you're zoomed in like this and the lens is out like that, it changes. Your range then will only go f5.6 through f36. I should point out, however, that even though the lowest you can go when it's extended like this is f5.6, that because of the way the barrel is designed and because you're photographing something that's some distance away, you can actually still get fairly good bokeh portrait shots when it's fully extended, if you get it down to the lowest possible setting of f5.6. If you're not getting that bokeh, it's probably because if you're using the auto settings, the camera isn't getting you down to 5.6. And so that's another good reason to be able to learn how to use the manual settings. You can bring it down as low as your lens will possibly allow at the range that you have it out to, and you'll still get a fairly decent looking shot. If you can invest some money into some better lenses, this camera, or this lens, I should say, has a range of 2.8, or is it 2.4? I forget now, all the way through. So when I'm completely zoomed in, it doesn't change. I can still get down to 2.8, I think it is, and get those really nice portrait shots, even when the barrel is all the way out there. And so I've been able to get some really beautiful shots with this lens over the years, but it does cost to get into. So we've talked about how the f-stop numbers can be a little confusing. Another way to remember it that might be helpful is the bigger the number, the less light is going to come through the lens to hit your sensor. The smaller the number, the more light is going to come through the lens. Perhaps the biggest thing to remember is, for that all-important creative control that we want, is that what you're looking for is the smaller the number, the less is going to be in focus. The lower the f-stop is, the more likely you're going to get those beautiful out-of-focus backgrounds. The higher the number, the more likely you're able to get those beautiful group shots or scenic landscapes where everything is in focus. You should probably try for an f-stop of 11 to 13 to get everything in focus. Now, the shutter speed setting is a lot more intuitive. The numbers, for example, as you turn the wheel, the numbers, when it says 1/60, 1/60th, means that your shutter door is going to be open for 1/60th of a second. If, as you're turning this wheel, you see that number go up to, say, 1/1000 or 1/1000th, it means that your shutter door is only going to be open for 1/1000th of a second. And that simply means that you're going to be more likely to freeze the action. Now, when you're working with complete manual settings, the most important thing to remember is that when you adjust, say, the shutter speed to get the exact shutter you want, whether it's to freeze somebody or an object in motion, or to get the motion blur, say, of a waterfall, as you make the adjustments to the shutter speed to get what you want creatively, you are going to have to also at the same time make adjustments to the f-stop so that the needle, that all-important needle on your meter, is going to be as close to the center as possible. Now, it's okay if it's not exactly in the center, especially if you're shooting raw. You have your menu set to take photos in the RAW setting, or at the very least RAW and JPEG. If you're shooting in RAW, you can get away with being a little over or a little under that center spot. But just know that every time you make an adjustment to one wheel, you're going to have to make a corresponding adjustment to the back wheel, or the opposite wheel, in order to keep that needle in the center to get a correctly exposed shot. Once you understand that, it's going to become very easy for you to be creative with either your shutter speed or your f-stop, whatever you're trying to do, and very quickly make the corresponding adjustment to the other wheel to get your needle in the center, or if you're using the back screen, to get the photograph, get the image looking correctly exposed on the screen. And some people will find that a lot easier than trying to keep your eye down on the meter to make sure your needle's in the center. Just look at the photograph, the image on the back of the screen, and determine whether it's correctly exposed or not, just by sliding your wheels back and forth and compensating. If you want a high shutter speed, you also have to roll the f-stop back to open up more light, because the shutter's only going to be open for 1,000th of a second. You need to have your aperture open wider to let the light come in, enough light so that the sensor can form an image. Once you master that, you're good to go. Now, if you get yourself into a lower light situation, or it's getting darker out, you may find that you can have the shutter speed all the way down to, say, 60th of a second, and your f-stop open as wide as possible. You get the biggest opening that you can get with your lens, and your needle is still not in the center. It's still way underexposed because it's getting dark, or you're inside. What to do? Do I have to open up the flash? I really hope not, because that's really going to destroy your shot. I like to say never use the pop-up flash of these entry-level cameras. It's going to just really ruin your shot. Do whatever you can to avoid using the pop-up flash. If you find that you're having to take a lot of shots in dark rooms, it's better to get an external flash, and we'll have to do a lesson on how to do external flash photography. So you're in that lower light situation. What can you do to get a correctly exposed shot? Well, remember, don't forget, you've got a third setting that you can adjust. It's your ISO setting. How you change it, it's a button here at the top on the 90D camera. On other cameras, it'll probably be located in different places, but look for the ISO button. You might remember in our last lesson, I told you that I want you to get to the point where you can be taking photographs in the manual settings, even in a dark room. And what we've learned so far, you can probably see that it's quite easy to do that in the dark, just adjusting your shutter speed, adjusting your f-stop with these wheels, and keeping your eye on the screen back here to make sure that you're getting correctly exposed shots. But what if you have to change the ISO in the dark? The ISO button on the 90D camera might be different on other cameras, but on the 90D camera, you'll see it's right at the top. But there's all sorts of other buttons there too. How in the dark are you going to know which button to hit in order to be able to start changing your ISO? Well, Canon has made that easy for you. If you take a close look at your ISO, you'll notice that there's a little indentation on the ISO button. with a little notch in the center of the indented button. And so with your eyes closed, just gently roll your finger across all of those buttons at the top, and you'll notice that the ISO button feels different. So even in the dark, you should be able to, with a little practice, find that ISO button, just press it down, and you'll see that your screen changes to show you the ISO. And as you turn either the top or the back wheel, you will see that you can change your ISO settings. So if you're in a dark room, in a low light setting, you might want to just touch that ISO button and scroll that wheel up so that you've got an ISO of 1,000, maybe 1,600. And now you will open up a whole new range of possibilities with your shutter speed and f-stop, and be able to get nicely exposed photographs even in a darker setting. So don't forget about your third wheel here. It's not really a wheel, but it's a button, and then you scroll the wheel. The other scenario where you might want to change the ISO is if it is, the sun is starting to go down and you're still out on the football field and you wanted to get those freeze frame shots. But even with your f-stop wide open, you're not able to put your shutter speed up high enough to freeze the action. You started out in the bright sunlight in the afternoon and you set your camera to ISO 100, but as the evening progresses, you find that you're not able to stop the action like you used to. Remember, you can change the ISO, and that will again allow you to get those high shutter speeds at the f-stop that you want. Let's say it's at the end of the hike, the sun's starting to go down, but you want that last group shot, and you find that all day long you've been filming at ISO 100, but now as it's getting to dusk, you can't get an f-stop of f11 for that all-in-focus shot. Well, remember, you've got the ISO to adjust. So just quickly hit the ISO button, hit the wheel, go up to 1,000 ISO, and all of a sudden now you'll be able to set your f-stop at f11 and able to keep your shutter speed above 60 or above, and you'll be able to still get your shot. Don't forget about your ISO. I said set it and forget it, but still keep it in the back of your mind that is the last adjustment that you can make to give you another whole wide range of opportunities as the sun starts to go down or as you have to move into an inside environment. All right, well, that is the theory, and showing you all the physical settings and wheels and dials that you can adjust to get great photos in the manual mode. Now, the next step that you need to do is actually go out and spend an afternoon practicing, and I want to emphasize practicing, working in the manual settings. You will only really become good at this through practice. Put some hours in to train yourself to the point where you will be making all of these adjustments without really having to think about it. It'll just become second nature to you. You'll have built up a muscle memory that you can concentrate on the framing, and the other just comes so natural to you that you don't have to stop and think about it. So now you're ready. Go forth, find a nice park, start out with an appropriate ISO setting for the environment that you find yourself in, and start shooting objects, people, scenics, buildings, all getting the right exposure by adjusting the top and back wheel. When you get comfortable with that, then start getting creative. Think and remember what you need to do to get those nice, beautiful portrait shots with the background out of focus. What combination of your wheel settings is going to give you shots where everything is in focus? What combination of wheel settings do you need for freeze frames? What combination do you need to get the motion blur? Remember, if you can't get the exposure meter in the center for the type of shot that you're trying to get, remember you have the option to change the ISO to give you a whole new range of possibilities. I believe that you will find that after you have 4 or 5 good practice sessions like this, you will find that you will get to the point where you will be able to make all of these adjustments easily, almost without thinking about what you're doing. Well, that's it for my lesson today. I hope that you have found it helpful. If so, please, it always helps if you give us a like. And if you haven't yet, why not subscribe for more lessons like this? Catch you down the road.